So, today we're going to talk about a story that really shook Hollywood and the whole world, the sudden and tragic death of actor Heath Ledger. Now, for years, his story has been wrapped up in all this myth, but the reality is so much more human and, honestly, way more disturbing. Let's try to cut through all that noise and get to the real, heartbreaking facts.
Just 28. That's how old he was. He was found alone in his New York apartment back in January of 2008, right at the absolute pinnacle of his career. He was on the verge of becoming this absolute legend for what would be his most iconic role, and he never got to see it.
And of course, that very role is what kicked off the biggest question, right? The myth that has kind of defined his death for more than a decade now. Did his incredible, all-consuming performance as the Joker somehow lead to his death? It's a really dramatic idea, but it's just not what happened.
Okay, so to really get what happened, we have to start with the story everyone thinks they know. This idea that the darkness of the Joker was so deep that it just completely consumed him.
And this idea, this narrative, it just took over. But why? Well, it's pretty simple. When something tragic and complicated happens, we tend to look for an easy villain to blame. And for this story, the Joker was the perfect scapegoat. But real life is almost never that black and white.
All right, so let's push that myth aside and talk about the reality of his final days. Because this isn't a story about a comic book villain. It's about a real person, a real human being, who was obviously deeply struggling. And this quote, it just totally flips that Joker myth on its head. The people who actually saw him, who were around him, they didn't see some guy possessed by a role. What they saw was someone who was just completely wiped out, totally running on fumes, but still trying to push through and do his job.
And this, right here, is maybe the most important piece of the puzzle. He wasn't out there chasing some reckless high. No, he was just chasing sleep. He had this brutal insomnia, made so much worse by his insane schedule. I mean, for him, nighttime wasn't for rest. It was like a punishment he had to endure. And he was just desperate for any kind of escape.
So you've got all these crazy rumors flying around, suicide, some dark conspiracy, the whole Joker thing. But the real answer? It wasn't going to come from the tabloids. It was going to come from science. And that's exactly what happened. The medical examiner's report came out, and it just cut through all of that noise. It gave a factual, clear-cut cause of death that had nothing to do with all the wild stories people were telling.
So what did it find? A deadly mix of prescription drugs. And this part is so important. These were legally prescribed medications. It wasn't an overdose of one thing. It was the combination, the mix of painkillers, anti-anxiety pills, and sleeping aids taken together that proved fatal.
The official term they used was acute intoxication. Basically, when you mix all these different depressants, they can just overwhelm your whole system. It's like they don't just help you relax or sleep, they can actually start shutting down the essential things your body does without you thinking about it, like breathing.
And that's what's so chilling and just quiet about this whole tragedy. Medical experts say he probably didn't feel a thing. No pain, no panic. He just wanted to get some rest, he fell asleep, and he never woke up.
So when you lay all the pieces out, the exhaustion, the terrible insomnia, his desperate search for some relief, you start to see this tragic picture of how all these pressures just piled up and led to something that was absolutely preventable. I mean, look at this. It was literally a perfect storm. First, you have this relentless career pressure, which brings on this horrible insomnia. Then, that sleeplessness makes him desperate for relief, so he turns to medication. And then, that search for sleep accidentally creates a deadly mix. It's a tragic domino effect.
And this is really the key takeaway from the medical experts who've looked at this case. This wasn't some dark destiny. It had nothing to do with a movie role preordaining his death. It was a situation that, with the right help, the right awareness, could have been completely avoided.
Which brings us to the final and most sobering truth of it all. You really have to tear down that whole Joker myth to see the real, deeply human story that was happening underneath.
And when you put them side by side, the contrast is just, wow. The myth wants you to believe a sinister villain killed him. But the reality? An invisible storm of pressure and exhaustion is what did it. The myth paints him as reckless. The reality is he was just a human being who was completely and utterly exhausted. It wasn't some big Hollywood conspiracy. It was a quiet, heartbreakingly common tragedy.
So no, the real killers here weren't some guy in makeup.
They were things we can all understand. Exhaustion, nonstop pressure, mental strain that just wasn't being treated, the hidden danger of mixing medications, and silence. The silence around the struggle. And these things, they affect millions of us, not just famous actors.
And that, right there, is the real disturbing truth. This story is so terrifying, not because it's some one-of-a-kind Hollywood mystery. It's terrifying because it's not unique. It's a reality that happens every single day, in quiet rooms, to regular people who are just in pain and trying to find a way to get some sleep.
So I guess I'll just leave you with this question to think about. In a world that's so obsessed with the performance, with the celebrity, how do we get better at actually seeing the vulnerable person behind it all? How do we learn to spot these quiet storms before they turn into tragedies? It's something worth asking, not just about stars, but about everyone.